Euro students to your chapter 14, basically European Age of Exploration here, and quite a bit simpler than maybe the chapters that we've covered up to this point. A lot less names and complicated themes to be covered here. This is pretty much straightforward, and it's going to feel real familiar to you from AP World. All right, so some of the big idea things that we have here is that Europeans are going to begin to they're going to the kings and queens are going to have enough power they've taken from the church due to the Renaissance and the Reformation, of course, and they're going to use this power, and they're going to basically try to oust the Muslims as middlemen traders. Remember, they've got luxury items thanks to the Crusades in the 1200s and 1100s and 1200s, and they've got a taste for that, but they want to do it on their own terms. So they know they're going to have to take out the Muslims to do so. Thanks to people like Henry the Navigator, they're going to help get the technology to make this possible. And of course, you need to know who the main players are in the European Age of Exploration. First and foremost, it's Portugal and Spain, with Portugal actually being the first. The size of Portugal, the size of their population and the resources is going to limit them, and so they will be passed up by Spain, and both of these will be passed up eventually by the Dutch, English, and French. And eventually, at the end of the day, we're going to declare probably the English as the grand champions of this rivalry for what becomes known as the New World. Another important concept to understand, we're going to see the beginning of a transition from agrarian economies, from where the vast majority of people are peasants and working on farmlands, to the growth of commercial and industrial economies. We're going to see more merchants and more investors and things like that. And of course, we have this profound contact with non-European peoples that are going to have some devastating effects on natives here in the New World. All right, so the motives. If we skip to the bottom, there's the motives that we're all familiar with, the three G's: God, glory, and gold. Most historians believe that it was that economy first, that we were thinking money first. And oh yeah, by the way, while we're at it, here's a bunch of people that we can, heathens as we saw them, and we can bring them to the light, and we can convert them. And of course, glory. I mean, your chance to make the history books, to become famous back home, for your name to be listed in the newspapers. But what got these adventurers, these conquistadors, or whoever they may be, these explorers, what got them going? Well, a lot of times it was the influence of books. Now, Marco Polo was an actual guy, and his books, his travels of Marco Polo are fairly accurate and have been corroborated with other sources over the years. But the first two on the list, the Travels of John Mandeville, he's a made-up guy with made-up stories that some fanciful writer out there did. And this, basically the same with Prester John. These are going to be guys that travel to exotic locations and see incredible things. And this, I can imagine, excites young boys out there reading their books. And as they grow into young men and get the means to do so, they want to go make their own mark. They want to see these places that have never been seen by Europeans before. Now, there are reasons why this becomes possible here in the late 1400s. And centralized monarchies is a big part of this. Like I said, they've gained more autonomy away from the church. Kings and queens have taken more power from their nobles, think absolute monarchy and whatnot. And so they have increased authority and they have increased resources. More wealth, new technologies are being invented. The things you have to have for those ships to be able to cross the Atlantic, the lateen cells. You put these triangular cells, mix them in with the square box cells that they'd had before, and it allows these ships to tack out against the wind because they were basically limited. Some of these winds are blowing so hard they simply couldn't sail into them. They couldn't go to the direction that they wanted to go. It's also important to note and I would write down, is that they discover wind patterns and they start mapping wind patterns. And they realize that sailing further out into the Atlantic will allow them to get back home. When they're coming back from Africa, when they're Diaz and Da Gama and people like that are coming back home, they can't hug the coast because the winds don't work that way. So they go out into the Atlantic and catch the backside of the winds, and that will catapult them back home fairly quickly. So that's an enormously important. Of course, the astrolabe probably would not have been possible to cross the Atlantic like they did without the astrolabe. This device, stolen from Muslims and Chinese, or should I say adopted from the Muslims and Chinese, it measures. It can give you the latitude, your latitude at any point. It measures celestial bodies day or night. You can use the moon and stars, or you can use the sun to give you the measurements you need to stay accurate. So this technology, we know that Henry the Navigator is one of the first to kind of start these schools, and they begin realizing that what they're trying to do basically is get a faster route to India and China. Now, it starts off with Bartholomew Diaz, who rounds the tip of Africa, but his men are about to mutiny, so he comes back. But 10 years later, you get Vasco da Gama, another Portuguese sailor, and he's going to be the first to make it all the way to India. And they make quite a bit among the investors, the people who funded the ship, who paid for the goods and all that stuff. They got a nice return on their investment from that trip. And from then on, it's basically, how can we get there? And the Portuguese are really we're going to talk about it a little bit later in the slides, but they're going to push the Muslims out of this trade. Meanwhile, Spain is going to take on Christopher Columbus, an Italian captain who has this crazy idea that, hey, we could sail west, and it'd be faster to go that way, and we could get to India and forget the Portuguese. They're doing it the silly way. Now, a lot of this was because of the maps of the time weren't all that accurate. And even then, Columbus thought that the maps were making the ocean bigger than it actually was. And so, for him, it would be a very simple thing to sail west and get east, basically. Obviously, we know that's not how it worked out, and that the ocean was quite a bit larger than what they had thought. The Portolani here. Here's some navigational maps based on descriptions of harbors and coast. As you can see, first being made in the 14th century, so the 1300s, so well before the Europeans start sending stuff out. But they do help. It does, at least the coastlines help when the age of exploration truly starts for the Europeans. Here's an astrolabe. Very important device. Now, again, important to note, Portuguese are the ones who start the age of expansion. They're the ones who get this thing going. They're going to do so by exploring the coast of Africa, a continent which not a whole lot was known about from the European viewpoint. And again, it just came under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator. This was something that was, his near and dear his heart. And they're going to do so for trade and also for Christianizing Africans wherever they could. Now, of course, Africans, besides having their own native religions, had already been heavily influenced by Islam. So Christianity got there a little bit late. Here's a picture of Henry the Navigator. In the western, at the rounding the Horn of Africa there, a lot of gold. And so the Europeans called this the Gold Coast. Diaz, we talked about, first one around the tip of Africa. This shows us how enormous Africa is, but that there's a bottom to it. And once you get on that other side, you can make your way up into India. Da Gama is the first one to reach India. He lands at the port of Calicut. He brings back these spices and makes a lot of money off of it. They go to war basically with the Arab traders and fleets, and their new gun technology is going to help them beat. They're mounting their ships with these big guns, and it's going to beat back the Arab vessels, and they're going to wrest a lot of control of the spices from India from the Muslims. Here's your little map. As you can see, they're hugging the coast, and they're going to set up forts to defend, for refueling their ships and for defense of their vessels. But they're making quite a bit of headway. Here's the Spice Islands out here. India, of course, here, very important. Eventually, when they make it to the New World, they're going to get, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, the division of the New World between the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Portuguese get ripped off. We know that. Spain gets this, and this is Portugal's line. But these are valuable sugar areas, sugar plantations, so they're going to make a lot of money off of that. Now, Alfonso de Albuquerque and the Portuguese, here they are. They're establishing permanent Portuguese bases at Goa on the west coast of India. Again, they're beginning to get very aggressive. They're working to destroy Arab spice trades. They want to push further east to China and to the Spice Islands there. But again, important to note that their empire will always be limited because of the size of their home country. It's just too small, with not enough resources and not enough people. I mean, you can't send out all your people to defend your investments in Asia and Africa in the New World. You don't have enough people at home to defend your homeland from Spain or from neighboring European countries. Now, why were the Portuguese so successful? Again, their guns. Their guns, and they were excellent sailors. This gave them some major advantages over the Arabs and, in the beginning days, over other European countries. Now, that's as far as the PowerPoint goes. There's probably some other things you should know, though, that the age of exploration will kind of begin the exploitation. I don't know if I'd say begin the exploitation, but it hastens the exploitation of Africa and African slaves. As Spain and Portugal come to the New World, they first use native resources for their slave labor on their plantations called encomiendas. However, we know that the slaves were not resistant to European diseases, and so smallpox and measles are killing huge percentages of natives, and so that's going to prompt them to turn to African labor, as the Africans had contact with Europeans for a long time, and so were fairly resistant to European diseases. There were, and that eventually Portugal is going to have to back off in the New World because they just simply cannot keep up with the other European powers, and that Spain is going to have to start giving away some of its New World possessions as it loses in Europe at the expense of, or that France and Spain, or that France and England are going to gain power in the New World. Okay. Okay. That's really, and we'll go into more detail about the colonizing Jamestown and the fact that the English control the Atlantic seaboard and that the French first occupy Canada, although they never have a large population there because they can't convince Frenchmen to leave the wonderful country of France to come to Canada to settle there. And the ones who do come over are typically single men who are fur trappers and things like that. But really, that's the age of exploration in a nutshell. We'll obviously go into more detail in class, but fairly straightforward for you guys.